This is what the Soviets would do. They would, in order to gain advance, they would throw people under the bus. It's like a way of excitation. If you can enrich yourself from getting things excited, whether that is in a positive or negative manner, in either way. So instead of going on the straight and narrow and finding a diagonal, they would rather combust enough things in order to find a genie in the bottle, or sink a ship because they think that there's a treasure chest in the ocean floor ridge. And you talk about sensors, but what about registers being altered? Luckily, the entire universe has a definite amount of atoms in it. Now, what those atoms are doing is hard to articulate and has prescribed demons to famous minds such as Laplace and Maxwell. These are what free ranges are to something that is unknown. And that's why it's that important to have safeguards on kill switches so that you're not part of the unknown. This would look like something of one-dimensional thinking. The fact that you don't need to have barriers between you and the land. Crazy as needing poles to be set on either side of a sidewalk. Though it might look cool, it is unnecessary, and what would lead something bigger than you, like a alpha, a predator, to think that you do need those there in order for you to feel safe, which would lead a culture to be as devoid as someone with a cheap tattoo doing cheap activity. I'm just gonna be sitting down. And so this goes back to the Revolution era before then, with the kings inside of the Renaissance era. It would be where the king would have all the hermits bent over, and he would be taller than all of them, such as the ability to everyone being brainwashed, and then one day he could wear invisible clothing and everyone not say a single word, just because they were all brainwashed and attuned to being bent over, when in turn, standing upright and having a thoughtful mind, a kid would say that the emperor wasn't wearing any clothes. Now, what this could mean to a science technocracy, one of which had the gall of an emperor and a king, would be that of which coupling and decoupling were made as extremities. Extremities for extraneous solutions are something where the math is there, but it doesn't have proper solutions, even though it turns out ones. These are different than holes in graphs, because holes in graphs are a physical depiction of an extraneous solution. They're not real, but they show up by default from the fracturing of the equation. A mere illusion. If you have a 2D plane and then imagery close and far, though being on 2D plane, can be enhanced by either sides of the 2D plane showing deep infinities. This will give an illusion that the figures have depth between them, a third dimension, despite there only being 2 dimension. This is an example of over accentuations as holes in graphs. And it's not the first idea for someone to tattoo their entire body black. Look at Michael Jackson doing the opposite, bleaching his whole epidermis white. These are all things that are not typical, but aren't miraculous just because they can occur and are broad as day, but rather is spectacular the condition of having to undergo that is emulated on scales. If a tattoo is small or if it's large, it's the condition of which it's applied to the skin that gives it a lasting effect of coupling or decoupling. What's the most natural toxin, rather? Having them all be byproducts. When it's things as simple as what allows the same capability to articulate and experiences like leather being soft, or how tattoos are plucking like skin as feathers are ruffled and made ink poured onto a chicken. You will see that that chicken has ink in it that stays longer than a chicken without its feathers ruffled and ink sprayed all about it. I think this is how flamingos are dyed. Expectance rates of how long tattoos will last are both incorporated with coupling and decoupling. This, in virtue of how soft leather is an articulation of how dry your skin is on a day-to-day basis and how calloused it is. If you have callous skin, ninjas would beat their people, and so that their whole body would imitate a callus. That's why in religions with the Egyptian, it's not a religion, it's a culture. But the culture gets so fascinated with themselves when they become decadent and satanic and they start sacrificing people in order to carry on their traditions. Which of the cultures were best? Was it the Vikings? Could it have been the Egyptians who had done it right? And that's why it's so powerful what they have found. Someone saying you're not fit enough to move into a scientific era. If it was that where anything that could bring in a top-down security system where everyone was scared to death unless you were part of it. If an AI drew up a line of thing is what happens when loose ends run astray. I've been trying to find some great depictions of graphics where it shows water disjoints the figure submerged in it if it is half in and half out of the liquid. And I know no one's always submerged in liquid, so it's not that prevalent, but in terms of fluidity, when the light, it's making a halt of least resistance because it isn't the material that is submerged. And so you see this phenomenon of the image being disjointed. This is also seen in shadows, and we're more acclimated to shadows because there's more shadows on things than there are water about stuff. And in terms of the Silver Surfer, his body is silver, but when he's articulated through the small casting of shadows about his anatomy, it's drawn up as, well, he's an alien, but he's supposed to be human-like. So the utilization of shadows on this silver-like body is described as being an aura, and those are like energies that are mysticism, so they're kind of like not entirely accepted in the science community, but neither would be a person with silver skin. So this guy, he interplays shadows and they appear as auras, but the auras aren't illuminating off of his body. They're shown within the shadows about his body. And so it's an acceptance because auras can be thought up as shadows if your exterior is extravagant enough to display what a projection hologram would be, an aura, but within the construct of just a shadow. So the fluid, instead of it being everywhere and projecting a disjoint, is just his extravagant exterior, which is silver. And so that accounts for both illusions in one. The importance of essence in terms of what an environment can encumber can be found within the comic book of Batman, where Poison Ivy, a student who studies botany, is told to uphold the villainous act and still ancient Egyptian artifacts from a Seattle museum from a botanist. This botanist uses these ancient Egyptian artifacts to try to kill her, but she gains immunity and holds a grudge against men. And so what if you were poisoned by an Egyptian artifact of herbal rare minerals from rare earth herbs, that would probably rewire your brain. And so she probably had this in tune with, in the environments of plants, of how to go about doing fantastic. Her nemesis, her ally, she later found and worked with this one, I want to say what's a mortal, but he was from a different dimension, and it was named Flora. We're in the plant life, and it got questioning into different dimensions as locations is nothing different than a political spectrum. If everyone's brainwashed, then the amount of relative reality is really relative as a grain of salt, especially if we're all salt of the earth.